Yep.
Okay, cool. So, welcome back, everyone. I'm really glad to welcome Alex Broadbent. So Alex Broadbent is a professor of philosophy at the University of Johannesburg. And his interests are in philosophy of medicine, philosophy of science generally, and particularly philosophy of epidemiology. So his talk today is entitled, "Either Philosophy Can Make the Difference Between Life and Death, or It Has No Place in Medical Education. Discuss." So over to you, Alex.
Thank you. I thought this would be an innovation for philosophy talks and papers. We can just formulate them as essays, and then we can all just mark them, and then the best one can be the prevailing theory. The question. So I mean, I never liked exams much, but I'm going to sort of pretend this is a model answer to the question. So the question suggests that, or the quote in the question suggests that philosophy should only be taught to graduate students, to medical students, if it makes a significant practical difference. So the difference between life and death, you know, what I really mean is just a practical difference of quite a significant kind, not just a tiny, trivial, occasional one, to the ability to cure people, make them better when they were ill. Or perhaps stop them from getting ill in the first place. And in the what I'm going to do is here we go. I am going to argue as follows in this essay. Firstly, I'm going to ask whether philosophy makes that kind of a difference. Can it make the difference between life and death? Does it make the difference between life and death? I'm going to say, well, maybe sometimes. Possibly, but basically no. I don't think teaching philosophy to medical students is justified on the practical outcomes. And I'm being slightly devil's advocate there, because I mean, I know in a sense that this is, you know, there's an idea that you know, perhaps it should, which is why there's this sort of a conference and so forth. But actually, I don't think that's the point of teaching philosophy to medical students. And I think it's based on the idea that it's only worth teaching medical students things that help them to cure people. And that's what I'm going to challenge in the second section. I'm going to deny what I called in my book the curative thesis, the curative model of medicine, which says that basically medicine is all about making people better and curing the sick. And I'm going to argue against that. And of course, that makes space for philosophy to actually be worth teaching to medical students, even though, or even if it doesn't make that much or significant enough difference to be worth teaching to all medical students. I'm going to set out in the third section my model of medicine, my inquiry model of medicine, which says that, which I have in my book, which says that medicine is an inquiry into the nature and causes of disease. But I leave it unsatisfactorily vague when I've written on this before, how that really leaves the relationship between science and medicine, and between medical research and medical practice. And so I was going to use the opportunity here to sort of think a little bit more about that. I can't say I've got that far, but I think that this particular context makes it interesting to ask, you know, well, what is it exactly on that view that doctors are then doing if they are supposed to be inquiring in some sense? And in the fourth part, I'm going to suggest that why teaching philosophy to doctors, why teaching them to be lovers of knowledge helps them to become good inquirers, which means helps them to be better doctors, since on the inquiry model of medicine, the core competence of being a doctor is inquiry, engaging in the inquiry into the nature and causes of disease. And then in conclusion, I'm going to give myself a good mark. So, does philosophy make a difference? Well, philosophy can make a big practical difference, but mostly, unsurprisingly, it mostly doesn't. I mean, it can in principle. I think, firstly, it's worth distinguishing two ways that you can think of philosophy making a difference. I do believe, and this is where I actually devote a lot of my time and my energy as a researcher, working on the philosophy of epidemiology in particular, that philosophical conceptual idea-y things can have a huge influence on, in a practical sense, on disciplines and on what we know and on what we do and on what we end up discovering. I don't think, however, that goes for necessarily that transfers over to medical practice, which I'll explain. And I don't think that philosophy, as it's often explained in the analytical tradition, really makes it clear why that should be. I mean, the kinds of things that are on offer in the sort of post schism world, the world after the schism between analytic and continental philosophy. You've got conceptual analysis, such as untangling our implications of our linguistic intuitions. Or Lewis has a sort of cost-benefit thing going on. We weigh up the costs of having this intuition versus that one. It's very hard to see how any of that has anything to do with medicine, or why a medic would care about any of that, why a medical professional would care about any of that. And if you're with Wittgenstein, then you think philosophy is a kind of a therapy, then it kind of, it does connect it with medicine, but perhaps not in the kind of a way that we really have in mind when we're thinking about teaching philosophy to medical students. Mel Lemoine has argued that the field is philosophy of medicine itself becomes something of a game. He's talking about the sort of debates about naturalism and normativism about disease, and he sort of asks, what's the point? What's the point of this? And I think it's a very good question. But the way that we define ourselves, I mean, starting on the philosophy side, the way that we define what we do, I must say, doesn't always lend itself to demonstrating the perspicuity of our contributions to the medical context. On the other hand, the philosophy of an age clearly is in an interactive relationship with medicine, and I do think, as I say, that philosophers have a great deal to contribute to science, to medicine, and to all kinds of things in this context by participating in the processes of discovery and of changing a worldview, which lead us to new discoveries. I mean, one example is William Harvey's discovery of the role of the heart in circulating blood. Before that, it wasn't known that blood circulated. He established that it was through a series of mechanical arguments, nothing to do with the purpose for which the blood might be circulating. And although he did explain the function of the heart teleologically in the sense that it was in terms of its function circulating blood, he didn't give any reason for the circulation of the blood. So his arguments were very mechanical. They're entirely mechanical. They were to do with, look what happens when you strap your forearm and the veins expand, so it must be filling up, so the blood must be circulating and coming back, and so forth. So this was, and this is widely cited, this episode as a kind of a crucial episode in the switch from a kind of Aristotelian more towards a sort of more mechanistic philosophy. And to the demise of final causes. Another example more recently is evidence-based medicine. I mean, it must be said that evidence-based medicine, so I'm not saying there was explicit philosophical work. In fact, many philosophers don't like it. The point is that the kind of reasoning that goes on to establish that randomized controlled trials are better than cohort studies, which are better than case control studies, at eliminating confounders and at dealing, preventing residual confounding, is conceptual work. It's not obviously it's not going to be an empirical test that establishes that. It is the case that the track record of observational studies was a significant spur to this movement, but the arrangement in this kind of hierarchy is a conceptual exercise. I'm not saying that they did it very well, and they probably could have used studying some philosophy. So I'm not saying they were philosophers. I'm saying that philosophy, in the general sense of your conceptual arguments and ideas about how the world works, can shape and do shape medicine. So philosophy clearly, I think, does interact with medicine and has done, and for a long, long time. Important medical evidence have philosophical aspects, but does it follow from that ordinary doctors heal better if they're philosophically trained? Well, it certainly doesn't follow. So what are the reasons that you might think that ordinary doctors should be philosophically trained? Well, does it give them relevant knowledge about effective cures? I'm just putting this in here to get it out of the way. Obviously, it doesn't. Nobody thinks that philosophy is medicine. Nobody thinks we should teach medical students philosophy so that they learn about bones. The idea is they learn about philosophy, and that will help them dealing with broken bones. So, and in fact, of course, reasoning a priori has a terrible track record in medicine. It's notoriously unreliable. Things that feel like they ought to work according to the contemporary worldview of the time actually don't. You know, bloodletting is actually generally not a good idea, for example, even though it does calm the patient down. Does philosophical training help doctors to be ethical? I'm being a little bit of a devil's advocate here, but I'm going to say, well, it's far from obvious that it does. I think learning ethical precepts will obviously help to guide action. You know, it's just another set of rules about what you do in a certain situation. Studying ethics, though, actually studying ethics, you know, Juliet was laying emphasis on you know, sort of being clear about what philosophy actually is, and actually doing ethics as a medical student. And will that help you to be a better decision maker in a moral sense? It's unclear, and it's certainly, you know, there are some rather, you know, I mean, there's some rather insalubrious examples of famous ethicists going off the rails morally. You have, you know, people who are morally very articulate, but do things that are just obviously, you know, wrong, basically violent, you know, woke thugs. You have, on the other hand, you have sort of salt of the earth types who are, you know, whose views are probably pretty horrendous, but are actually, you know, rather virtuous people. And this is and would put themselves, you know, before others. And this is you know, there's a whole field of this virtue ethics. I mean, you know, it's far from clear what the relationship is between ethical knowledge, or even the ability to be a skilled reasoner of the kind that we mean when we talk about an ethicist, and being good. And in fact, I'm sure, you know, if this were an in-person conference after this, we could all exchange stories about, you know, arsehole ethicists we have known. Does it help us? Does it help people to reason well about the effectiveness of a contemplated cure? So this is on the sort of reasoning, you know, the reasoning side of things, the ability to think critically about evidence. And here, again, it's often said, and I've said this myself when I'm talking to people about how wonderful philosophy is, that doing philosophy helps you to be a critical thinker. And, you know, I'm not actually sure that this is enough to teach medical students. I mean, there are lots of ways to be a good critical thinker, and lots of people who are good critical thinkers who've never studied philosophy. Maybe we're drawn to it because of the kind of thing it is, but it's unclear. I think certainly it's clear that you can learn very useful rules like Pythagoras' theorem. You can learn precepts, you can learn methodological precepts, you can learn things that will help you to, you know, avoid affirming the consequent, without necessarily having to engage in philosophy in the sense of actually studying philosophy. You could just learn some stuff that gets kind of, you know, you just have to add it to your list of things to learn. The other things that I do think trained reasoning ability is somewhat domain specific for many people, and that's just because I mean, you know, again, this is good coffee conversations, but there are lots of good philosophers who are useless on committees, and there are lots of people who are really quite smart on committees, but you really wouldn't want to do philosophy with them. I mean, I don't, you know, there are lots of contexts that are on the face of them are quite similar, but actually, the ability to reason well in that context does seem to be quite context dependent. You can have people who are remarkably smart in one context, but say, you know, asinine things in another. And that goes for philosophers as much as for anyone else. We're as bad, you know, if I start holding forth about something I don't know about, the fact I'm a philosopher doesn't help me much. In fact, perhaps it even makes it worse. So it's just very unclear that there's a very useful connection between a sort of abstract reasoning ability that philosophy might train and medicine. I do think there's perhaps, I mean, what I'm not talking about here is the role specifically of philosophy of medicine. And that's something that occurred to me in Juliet's talk that I hadn't really thought about, like specifically studying philosophy of medicine Does that specifically help? And I think that, but I think that again, I think they're the issue. You know, from a practice point of view, I mean, it's different when we're talking about shaping the discipline and shaping the shape of medicine. And yet, yes, there's a huge potential connection. But from teaching people who are going to actually go out and be doctors, I suspect that in terms of actually making a practical difference to how effectively they prescribe potential cures, precepts are really what's going to make the difference there. If there are good precepts coming out of it, the ability to reflect, I don't have a negative. I can't prove the negative, but I think there's quite a strong burden of proof of discharge to explain why one would think that should be the case. And does it help their bedside manner? Well, I agree with Juliet on this humanizing business. I mean, philosophers are not noted for their bedside manner. They're not noted for being particularly human. In fact, sometimes perhaps even the opposite. Philosophers have criticized themselves for being too aggressive as a discipline, and all of these familiar things. So philosophical training, I think there's a pretty strong, it's a pretty strong claim to say, look, everybody who studies medicine needs to do some philosophy because it's going to make them better at curing people in a significant way. I think there isn't evidence or argument adequate to support a general proposition that medical doctors would be more effective in this sense, more effective at making people better if philosophically trained. And it's maybe a little bit, maybe sometimes, but in a general sense, I don't think so. They can learn ethical and methodological precepts without needing a proper training in philosophy. And I think it's important we don't kid ourselves. And again, this is devil's advocate, but if I were the sort of curmudgeon-y dean of a medical school, being asked to give a post to a philosopher, I would say, well, I care no more about my doctor's philosophical abilities than about their crossword solving skills. I mean, yes, there might be some general connection. Somebody's clever and they're good at, thinking things through. But beyond that, it's really a window dressing. So that's the I'm stating that's probably stronger than I really believe it. Partly just to sort of set out that position, which I suspect is dominant among medical deans. The second thing I want to say, though, is that I don't think philosophy needs to make a difference in that sense to be important to be taught. And the assumption that medical education is all about learning to save lives is mistaken. And that, I think, is surprising. So perhaps it's not surprising when we step back to think that philosophy is not that useful at saving lives, but it is rather surprising to hear that medicine actually isn't really about saving lives either. So there is an implicit curative thesis. This italicized bit is how I characterize it in my book on the philosophy of medicine from last year. I say medicine is the sustained and organized effort to heal the sick or prevent them from getting sick in the first place. So if that were correct, if medicine were a sustained and organized effort to heal the sick, then obviously that would suggest that medical education should all be directed towards making doctors better at healing. And I think that is probably why those curmudgeon-y medical deans are curmudgeon-y in the way that they are, because they are committed to something like this curative thesis. But I think the curative thesis is false. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time explaining that, and then come back to the place of medical education. So cure is I think, the goal of medicine. I think it's a very, very difficult, I think there's a lot of complicated things to say about the goal, how different goals interact. Is this a claim about all medicine, or about is it normative, or is it descriptive? Is it about what medicine should be or is like? And I'm aware there's lots to be discussed there. The short story that I want to present here is just that cure is, on the face of it, the ostensible goal that a majority of people who are recognizable as medical practitioners share across time and place. In fact, I'd like to say probably all, but just to avoid argument, I'll just say the majority. It's quite hard to think of things that are quite obviously medicine in different times and places in different cultures that don't have cure as a goal. I want to set aside the question of prevention, because I think that prevention and cure are, in a certain sense, two sides of the same coin. They're both about achieving the absence of a disease. One is about achieving that absence before the onset, and one is about achieving it afterwards. I know that in other contexts, that's a very silly thing to say, because this whole notion of preventive medicine sort of emerged as an alternative to in the later 20th century, an alternative to what was seen as a kind of or alternative sort of clinical approaches where you prescribe something after the disease has arrived. I'm aware of all that, but from this perspective and from a larger picture, where you look at the kinds of things that medical practitioners do and have done in many societies, they are typically concerned to some extent with both prevention and cure. We do regard it as medical expertise, telling people how they should live so as to avoid disease, and that's certainly been the case in many other cultures. I think that the curative thesis, somebody who thinks that prevention is a goal, is just as much in line with the curative thesis as someone who thinks it's cure. I don't. The disagreement between those two sort of aspects of contemporary medical thinking isn't what I'm got in focus here. I don't think that pain relief is a goal of medicine. I think that's a use of medicine rather than a defining goal. And that is because I don't think that all societies place the same disvalue on pain that we do. In fact, not even all contemporary societies, but certainly if you look at if you look at Sparta for the sort of iconic example, I mean, you can imagine and in fact, many ancient doctors would have caused pain without while curing or acting. And even in our world, there are many things. It's actually a bit of a myth that modern medicine doesn't involve pain. In fact, it does involve quite a lot of pain. Many things cause pain or discomfort or side effects or something. So, I mean, this is not the point of this talk. All I'm doing is motivating the idea that cure is a fair candidate for the goal of medicine, and to this extent, the curative thesis is correct. But I want to distinguish the core business of medicine from the goal of medicine. So the curative thesis says basically that medicine is all about cure. That's its goal, and that's its core business. And that I want to reject. Cure may be the goal, but it's not the core business of medicine, where the core business is exercising some skill or some competence that this profession generally possesses, but others don't. And it's not your core business if you can't do it reliably. If you imagine getting into a taxi in New York and saying, I'll take you to the Empire State Building, and the guy sort of takes you somewhere nearby to a shoe shop and says, well, you can get some good trainers here. That'll be $50, please. You wouldn't be satisfied at all. But in many cases, that's, I think, what doctors do is something like that. They don't actually offer you a cure. Cures are the exception in the history and the geography of medicine. And we do now have an expectation that medicine will be delivering us cures, but I'll give you some more examples later. There are still many examples of things that can't be cured, and of respectable medical disciplines that don't offer effective cures. Now, with this blacksmith example, imagine that you had a royal blacksmith who was appointed and revered by the queen, and but all that they did was hammer bits of metal pretty randomly. Sometimes you get a horseshoe and sometimes you don't. It would be hard to say that their core business were making horseshoes, because you're paying them and they're not doing it. Likewise, it's hard to think that the taxi driver I described first time round, if his core business was taking you from A to B, then you wouldn't pay him for taking you to the shoe shop when you asked to go to the Empire State Building. And yet medics do get paid, doctors do get paid. Medicine doesn't reliably cure, and yet it's lucrative, to put it in a very straightforward way, regardless of that. The argument, so to formalize this, here's an argument from the persistence of ineffective medicine. If the core business of medicine were to heal the sick, then medical traditions, disciplines, practices, interventions that were unable to reliably cure the sick would not persist. I call this the no bullshit premise, and in the book I explain that I'm using the word bullshit in the way that Harry Frankfurt does, meaning things that are uttered without regard for their truth and falsity. And yet, it's actually quite a useful technical concept in this particular concept. I'm pleased to say, but they do persist, and therefore it's not the case that the core business of medicine is to heal the sick. Now that's compressed. I'm really setting it up to explain, to get to the bit I want to talk about the way this relates to medical education. So if the core business of medicine is not to cure, but its goal is to cure, then what is the core business of medicine? And this is Lewis Thomas on his medical education in the 1930s. This is one of a number of quotes that sort of put me on this kind of path, not just from him. Our task for the future was to be diagnoses and explanation. Explanation was the real business of medicine. What the ill patient and his family wanted most was to know the name of the illness, and then, if possible, what had caused it. And finally, most important of all, how it was likely to turn out. So the first thing is that this is he uses the word business. This is the comment on the business of medicine. The task is not the goal, not the reason we became doctors, but the business, the task. It's the reality rather than the ideal. He expresses himself unclearly. He says it was the task was to be diagnosis and explanation. He means there to put those two things as one thing, I think. So he thinks that, I think he's lumping those two things together, I think. And then he's distinguishing prediction, which he then adds in and says, oh, by the way, that's even the most important thing. So the two ingredients that seem to be central to him are explanation and prediction. It would have been helpful, perhaps, if he'd studied philosophy, he could have written that paragraph more clearly. But that wouldn't necessarily have made him a better doctor. So starting from that clue, that seed, this is the inquiry model of medicine. Medicine is an inquiry into the nature and causes of health and disease for the purposes of cure and prevention. So the purpose stays the same as a curative model, but the nature of medicine is different. It's an inquiry. So it's not the nature of medicine. The nature of medicine consists in both the core business and the goal, but the core business is different. And I am assimilating prediction and understanding. I'm seeing those two activities pointing towards a sort of general thing that I'm going to call inquiry. Hopefully that does yield cure. I'm not denying that we want cures from medicine. We absolutely do. But, and there's a lot of historical, I think, of historical evidence to back this up. Biomedical understanding long outstripped breakthroughs in curative medicine. And yet we had medicine. We had medicine just like we had blacksmiths for years and years and years. And in many different cultures, you have this thing that doesn't deliver many cures for most of its existence. And I suggest still, even confining our attention, as most of the analytic literature does, to contemporary, biomedicine as it's found in America and to some extent the UK and Australia, you still have ineffective medicine, large chunks of it. It's just that we've kind of forgotten that. So viral infections, cancer, depression, and back pain are commonly incurable or unpreventable. And correspondingly, on the right, I've got the medical fields that are significantly ineffective. Virology is significantly ineffective. I'm not saying it doesn't do anything, but it's really not as if we've won the fight against viruses in any sense. Oncology, psychiatry, orthopedics relating to back pain. You get people who are experts on backs, but I have a bad back. What do I do? There isn't really anything. Even though there's all kinds of scans you can get, and you can there's not a great deal that you can really be done. And yet we still respect these people as medical experts. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't respect them as medical experts. So there's two arguments about what might be going on here. One is a kind of an inference to the best explanation argument. So that's the one I've been stressing. That we accept, we respect, and we pay for explanations and predictions, even when we can't get a cure. And the best explanation for that is that these things are essential to medicine. Explanations, predictions, inquiry is essential to medicine. It's a core part of medicine, and we're willing to pay for it. The fact we're willing to pay for it shows that we recognize it to be a core part of medicine. That's the best explanation for the fact that we're willing to pay for it. The other is a primacy argument. That understanding tends to be temporary prior to cure. Not always. You can have effective cures that you don't know how they work, but generally in medicine, as a matter of historical fact, we have accumulated much more understanding than we have cure. And the other thing is that prediction is logically prior to cure. So you can't, it's not a cure if you give something to somebody, if you accidentally make somebody better. It's not really the exercise of anything that could reasonably be called a medical competence. So on this, getting back to medical education, which is what I really want to be talking about for the last phase of the talk. What is medical education going to look like on the inquiry model of medicine? I've suggested that on the curative thesis, philosophy doesn't, it's very hard to find a place for philosophy in medical education on the curative thesis, because I've suggested that it's hard to make a case that philosophy makes doctors better at healing the sick. But if the core business is inquiry, then medical education as a whole needs to serve inquiry, needs to make doctors able to do what they have to do for their core business. And it's very natural to think that philosophy could help with this, could help teach inquiry. And in my book, I left it very vague, I think, as I mentioned, what practicing doctors need to do to engage with inquiry. And this invites the objection that I kind of blur the line between medical research and actually being a doctor. It makes it, it makes it sound like, it makes it sound like medicine just is about, it just is a kind of a branch of science, which historically it isn't, and practically it isn't. So I see an opportunity here to think more and say a little bit more about what inquiry would be for the practicing doctor as opposed to the medical scientist. So the fourth part, learning to inquire. The thought here, the slogan is, training doctors in philosophy helps them to turn an illness into an inquiry. So what sort of inquiry do doctors make? And I can think, I can think of, and this is the most experimental part of the talk, the new stuff. I mean, I can think of two ways that you might understand the injunction to engage with an inquiry or make an inquiry. One of them is to map this case onto what's previously known. And that, I think, is very much what evidence-based medicine, what expert systems approaches, machine learning all focus on. The idea is, look, here's this case in front of me. This is a clinical encounter, but this is not research. This is a clinical encounter. I've got evidence, a lot of evidence from actual proper research done according to very high standards. I need to see to what extent this case does or doesn't fit with that bunch of evidence. So this does enable prediction and understanding in some sense, but it can also be very frustrating for patients. And I was wondering as well whether this idea of trying to humanize doctors and humanize evidence-based medicine might get a foothold here. I don't like that idea. I also don't think it's got anything to do with humanizing, anything like that. But I do think that there might be a sort of non-moral, reason that people should be dissatisfied with with the repression of the individual in this context. So with just seeing this case as being slotting into a larger framework, there might be a deeper reason for that. And that might be that actually engaging with the project of understanding requires something different. It requires learning about and perhaps from this particular case. Of course, doctors historically were investigators and did record their cases, some of them. I mean, the origins of scholarly medicine are from doctors recording their encounters with patients. You know, until the advent of scientific medicine, when that, you know, became basically considered irrelevant as a source of medical evidence. And for the, you know, for a very, very, very long time, that this was where medical knowledge was found and came from, and there wasn't a clear separation between the, you know, the process of medical research and the process of medical, you know, and the normal medical encounter. This remains, you know, has remained the case more recently in you know, in psychology and psychiatry and so forth. So these two notions of inquiry, one is a kind of mapping of this case to what's previously known, where there's a clear separation between the case and the research activity, which basically goes on elsewhere, unless it doesn't fit, in which case you sort of send an email to your scientist saying, this one doesn't fit, please help. And then the other kind, where you actually engage in this case. This case is an inquiry, becomes an inquiry. And to do that, that means attending to the differences, the unique features, and the problems that this case poses. You know, that rash has been there longer than it should have been. That doesn't fit. That's wrong. Openness to existing knowledge being wrong, obviously. You know, this case might be new, existing knowledge might be incomplete, and openness just to being wrong oneself as well. I think these are all things that are essential to the kind of engagement with a particular inquiry that that perhaps doctors, I say, do, or perhaps should, or that one might think of as being characteristic of doctors more generally, when you set aside the very specific way that medicine is done in a contemporary biomedical context, in theory. Anyway, the point is, engaging with the project of understanding would certainly seem to require the latter set of activities, not just mapping onto a previous domain of knowledge. So I want to say a bit more about these three things I bolded here: problems, existing knowledge being wrong, and openness to being wrong oneself. I think these are all things that philosophy might be able to help with. Being focused on problems and comfortable with problems is, I think, something that philosophers do, you know, quite well. I think, and I discovered this when I started talking to epidemiologists, and I realized that, you know, people didn't like it when I said, oh, that's a problem. You know, whereas for me, obviously, you know, I've been engrossed in philosophy doing my doctorate, and you know, that was how we talked, and we talked about, oh, that's an interesting problem. That's not great in a medical context to hear that something is a problem. So the ability just to be comfortable and to feel like an expert while you are still talking about something you don't understand is perhaps something that's that philosophical training can contribute in the context of making somebody a better inquirer. The ability to be expertly ignorant could be served by philosophical training. It might, you know, yeah. Obviously, being able to question received knowledge is absolutely fundamental to philosophy, the activity, as opposed to, you know, a philosophy, a worldview. Not all obviously, that it's not the case that all worldviews think that they should question received knowledge, pretty much, obviously. But what we describe as philosophy in academic context, I think, is very characteristically about questioning received views. It starts with that. Every philosophical education that I can think of worth its salt has, pretty near the beginning, some attempt to get students to forget or to question something they thought they knew. It doesn't have to be the external world, but something or other. And being able to question oneself, being open to being wrong. I mean, this, I'm afraid, isn't something we teach particularly well in philosophy contexts. I think it's still, you know, a recipe for career success as a philosopher is still to be extremely stubborn and stick, you know, just defend to the, you know, to the hilt with intelligence, but nonetheless, without considering whether you are wrong, some extreme position. If you do that, that's still a pretty good recipe for success in philosophy. Admitting that you might be wrong in even in the nicest possible context, still, it's just a very deep human thing. People don't like doing it. They don't tend to respect other people who do it, even if they say they do. So I'm not clear that philosophical training helps so much with that, but perhaps it should. And certainly the great philosophical, paragons, have often, I mean, Socrates being the obvious example, have epitomized that ability to be epistemically humble. I'm not sure we teach it yet, but perhaps that's something that tells us about how we could change how we teach philosophy and do philosophy to make that more effective. So teaching doctors to be lovers of knowledge, to summarize this, the technical component of predicting and explaining, I think, could be done by a computer. So, well, that kind of fracture usually heals pretty quick without a cast, so you don't need to put a cast on it. I mean, I'm not saying it can be done by a current computer, but you can see that isn't really that kind of explanation and prediction activity isn't really inquiry, and it's nor is it something that philosophy, I think, is going to be able to help substantially with. But I think that inquiring means more than just delivering predictions and explanations in that way. I think there's an active investigative component. What's going on in this case? What will happen in this case, in this particular case? And the competent doctor turns an illness into an inquiry. That's the slogan that I think I'm going to try and take away from this. The competent doctor turns an illness into an inquiry. And I think philosophical training does teach you to apply your mind rather than adopt a cookie cutter approach. At least, I mean, it should, as much as any education can. And in fact, perhaps cripplingly so. People who spend all their time doing philosophy sometimes never manage to do anything because they're constantly thinking about things. Finally, conclusion. Philosophy has a place in medical education because it supports the core medical competency, inquiry, not because it makes a difference between life and death. So in this essay, I have argued that the goal of medicine is to cure, but it often cannot do so, meaning that cure cannot be its core business. The core business of medicine is inquiry into the nature and causes of disease. Philosophy has a place in general medical education, not because it generally helps doctors to cure better, but because philosophical training supports the kind of engagement with the inquiry that doctors are expected to practice. Philosophical training helps doctors turn an illness into an inquiry. I conclude that Broadbent's inquiry model of medicine is correct and irrefutably refutes all other philosophical theories. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think I've unmuted everyone, so you can give us the clap. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Alex. That was great. So as before, for those of you who weren't here, you should be able to raise your hand by clicking the little blue hand button on the participants list. If you're not able to raise your hand because you're a speaker or for other reasons, just send me a message in the chat. So we've got one question so far, and that's from Alex Franklin. So go ahead, Alex.
Hi, thank you. That was really great, really interesting. I'm wondering if there isn't a case that could be made that even if cure is the sort of core business of medicine, there's still a kind of role for philosophy. And my reason for thinking that is that I guess I feel like cure isn't univocal. So when faced with this question of how to cure a given disease, one has to trade off kind of well-being and different ways of apportioning risk and different ways of thinking about whether or not a particular study does in fact tell us that a particular intervention will cure a given disease, that kind of thing. And it seems to me that this might be a pure kind of arbitrariness of how institutional boundaries or disciplinary boundaries have ended up being drawn. But philosophers happen to be the kind of groups of people who end up thinking more about decision and probability and well-being and how all these things kind of trade off. And so it might well be that philosophers are particularly well suited to training medical students in this aspect of cure, even if it's not necessarily so. I mean, one could imagine medicine having developed these kind of expertises and philosophy not having this particular role in helping with this sort of aspect of cure. Does that make sense? And does that sound right to you as a particular way of bringing philosophy back into the curative side?
I guess there's two things to say. Firstly, I mean, obviously, I think there are a lot of, I mean, the first thing to say is that there are, I'm sure, ways to get philosophy back into the curative side a bit. It might, you know, whether or not that particular one works, I don't want to, you know, I don't, my nuanced view wouldn't be as strong as perhaps as I stated. I think there probably are ways that, you know, that you could be a better doctor through this or that bit of philosophical education. It's just that it's not as, you know, at the level of generality at which these things are considered, it doesn't apply. You know, we're going to assign the following syllabus to all doctors. I mean, you can't justify that in a broad way, you know, by picking on a few potential, so that the strength of the justification won't be enough. But maybe I said enough about that in the talk. Regarding this particular sort of suggestion, if I understand you right, it's that philosophers are perhaps particularly well suited to training doctors in to delivering certain aspects of doctors' training, because of the way that the philosophers themselves are trained to think or to teach. Is that the thought?
Just, I mean, the subject matter of certain philosophers' expertise involves a trading off and a weighing up of particular kinds of, I don't know, I'm thinking particularly philosophy of science and how one can infer on the basis of a particular study what the particular kind of, or what the right intervention is, and how one can also more generally trade off sort of well-being and particular kind of risks, and that kind of thing, I think, might well suit certain philosophers' research specialities in a way that it wouldn't medical professionals or medical scientists.
Okay, so there are certain things that doctors have to learn, like how to do certain kinds of trade-offs, that philosophers would be better placed to teach than, you know, medical professors. Yeah, and I think that is quite plausible. I I'm not sure how far that really gets one. I don't sure how far that gets one in terms of actually the kind of, you know, if you look at the kind of, it was interesting, again, Juliet's talk was interesting, the worries that, you know, were evident in those reports about having non-philosophers teaching philosophy, and you know, what's the root of all those worries? Is it just that, you know, it seems to me that it's not fully captured by that role of philosophy in teaching of medicine. And I do think teaching philosophy to medical students is a good idea. For me, I think there's more to that. It's a good idea. There's more to it being a good idea than what you're describing. So I do think that what you're describing is quite plausible as something that's a good thing about having philosophers teach certain things to medical students. But I just think there's a lot more. I'd like to have a stronger argument for the value of philosophy in medical education. I guess that's what I would say.
Cool. Thank you.
Great. So the next person is James Wilson.
Thank you. Yeah. So you presented two different models of medicine. So there seemed to be a curative model and the inquiry model, and it occurred to me that it didn't map on completely brilliantly onto what's actually happened in medicine in about the last 50 or 60 years. So, I mean, one of the big stories has just been the rise of chronic disease, partly as a result of people living longer, but the expectation is that, you know, we just have a lot more, you know, dementia, arthritis, diabetes, and so on. And I think that for each of those conditions, medical treatment has improved very significantly over the last 20 or 30 years. There's no cure. They're chronic. They're still chronic illnesses, but that it seems to be an important element of what good medical care is allowing people to better manage symptoms, even though those symptoms don't have any prospect of cure. And I think that a lot of doctors might now see their role as very much encompassing the care of chronic treatments, where that involves a lot of helping the patient to balance and think about their own well-being rather than merely providing a biomedical cure. I'm not sure whether that would then fit into the inquiry model. It just seems that whatever it is that most doctors feel that they're doing, it's something rather broader than cure, even if it doesn't get as far as inquiry in your sense.
Yeah, okay, so I left out a few things. Well, one is that there is an important distinction that I have to draw between therapy and cure. So there are a lot there are, yeah, as you say, there are a lot of improvements in the way that we can manage somebody's condition that both make them live longer and more comfortably, which medicine has offered. But I'm and it's true that there's a lot of medical expertise in that, and I think that has improved fairly significantly. I also think in the last, I think curative abilities have also significantly improved. If you, okay, so let's do this. I mean, if you take a notion of cure, which is, look, actually, the disease goes, is going to go away, then we're going to make this disease go away. Then I think it is the case that there are still many areas where we don't have that, even where we do have therapies. So I think that's the first sort of obvious thing to say. I do think also that is a problem for medicine, and it's not what medicine hoped for when it had its curative breakthroughs in the early mid part of the 20th century. It was thought that viruses would fall like bacteria had, and they didn't. So I think a lot of what's happened since then has been a kind of backpedaling, where people have sort of had to sort of say, well, actually, no, this is actually okay after all, but yeah. So I mean, I would say that cure is what we really want from medicine. It's not to disvalue the other things we get from it, but as a goal, I think that's what we really want. I'm not sure how that doesn't fit with the inquiry thesis per se. Perhaps I missed that.
I think it was just a puzzle because you didn't really mention chronic illness at all in the talk, but yet no. It's, as it seems to be, the major part of what health systems in wealthy countries spend their money on. So it just seemed odd, as it were, yeah, to try to suggest that medicine was deeply committed to a model which doesn't seem to be right, given what all the money is actually spent on in health systems.
But why is it not? I'm just not seeing why the inquiry model is incompatible with spending money on uncurable diseases. I mean, the goal is cure. The core business is inquiry. I mean, I'm not seeing how that's really incompatible with with what you're describing.
Okay, maybe. Well, I guess you probably know your own view rather better than I do. It was maybe the thought I had was that I thought you somewhat mischaracterized the people you were disagreeing with, or at least there was a danger of setting it up as a straw man, as if to say that medicine has always had this curative desire, when it seems that given the rise of chronic illness, it's very implausible to think that that's what your goal is. If say you're a doctor who specializes in diabetes or arthritis, you're probably aware that, as it were, for the most part of your sort of 30 or 40 years career, you'll be helping people to manage in chronic conditions which aren't curable. That's what you sign up for.
I see. So So then the issue is about the relationship between the cure of the goal of medicine and the goal of an individual doctor or encounter. And I still think that So what you're saying is, look, anybody who goes into oncology knows that they're not probably going to be spending their time curing their patients of cancer. They're going to be spending their time doing something a bit different from that. Yeah, no, I take that point, but I think that I don't think it damages the actually the curative or the inquiry model, because the broader goal of medicine. I mean, the idea of characterizing a goal of something like medicine is a it's a very, very broad and vague one. I mean, this activity itself, this social institution, exists in order to bring it about that there isn't disease. Now, there are some diseases for which we can't do that, but nonetheless, we continue with we continue trying. In the absence of succeeding, there's something else that we do. I agree that we make people comfortable, and I agree that we have effective interventions that fall short of a cure, and there's a lot of vagueness in what counts as cure. There's all of that stuff. But what I'm really trying to push is that there must be something else as well that doesn't fall along that dimension. And that's the positive claim I'm trying to push in that model. So yeah, I see what you're saying. I don't. It's not fundamental. In fact, that kind of case is fundamentally the kind of case I'm interested in. So I see what you're saying, but I don't think it's fundamentally at odds with the model.
Okay.
Great. So the next person on my list is Juliet.
Yeah, I'm always surprised because when you talk of the fact that the goal of medicine is not cure, you don't give examples that seem obvious to me, like contraception, obstetrics, and plastic surgery. So I was just wondering about that.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not trying to cure my reproductive system if I want contraception. So yeah. And
yeah.
So, I mean, for me, they're so obvious that I was surprised you didn't mention them. And my other idea is about because so medicine in the case, in your talk means medicine as it is practiced or medicine as knowledge. But there is also medicine as the social health systems. And one idea could be that teaching philosophy to medical students could help them become better advocates for a better health care or better medical research. So this is just an idea I'm throwing because I like to define medicine as the health system. And I'm wondering what could be the effect of teaching philosophy to medical students on the system and like on the political level, and what whether we have health insurance or not and stuff like that.
Okay, so on the first one, I mean, in the book I do talk about plastic surgery. I just and things like that, and contraception. I don't know if I mentioned contraception, but things that where it's clearly not about cure. And what I basically say is that those things aren't medicine. So they are the use of medical skills to achieve something that we want, but that is basically not, it's not essential to medicine. I'm trying to characterize medicine in a way that's fairly constant across cultures and times, and a use of this set of skills in the contemporary Western world is might be contraception or might be plastic surgery or whatever, but and the goal of prescribing the pill or whatever isn't to cure disease of fertility or something. It's to achieve something else, but that's not that's the exercise of medical skill and knowledge to achieve something that's not really central to the goal of medicine. And I think it's only, in a sense, I feel like it's, I'm not correctly equipped as a philosopher to be talking about this stuff as an analytic philosopher, because in a sense what you need really is an anthropologist or a historian or something. Characterizing a complex social thing like medicine in a particular society is a, it's going to have a lot of this sort of messiness. But basically, that's my answer on that. On the second question, the medicine is a. So you're saying that. Can you say that again? So medicine is a health. Medicine is the health system. You're sort of trying to say is the health system? So you want to say that the medicine in the country is the health system in the country, that kind of idea.
So one definition I like to take of medicine is not a medicine as knowledge or practice, but more like what practical system we have in place to ensure that there is something, like there is some medicine going on afterwards. Because if you think of medicine in a vacuum, for me, it omits other issues, like do people have access to medicine, or do they don't have access to medicine? So this type of question for me so anyway, so basically what I'm trying to say that we could think maybe that medical students, if they are introduced to some philosophical literature on this topic, I'm thinking ethics, but I'm also thinking other topics, they could have a better understanding how medicine rely on many practical details in society.
Right.
And then maybe, because you can't change a health system without the physician in it, so.
Right. So, but that's an argument for maybe the having sort of generally literate, I mean, in a sense, humanities literate doctors. So for me, I mean, I think there's, I do think there's value in people who have, and I think that the contemporary world sees a lot of splintering, professionalization. It's thought that you can be a brilliant expert at one thing without knowing anything about something else, and then you see all kinds of crazy stuff happening in consequence. You get like, I don't know, someone like Elon Musk being celebrated as a genius, which in some ways perhaps he is, but on the other hand, his idea about the meaning of life is like, let's go and live on Mars. I mean, it's kind of like 10-year-old schoolboy level stuff. So I mean, you get this kind of imbalance, and I think that you could certainly get that in the medical profession too, where people just don't understand about the world in which they operate at anything like an appropriate level of detail for the kind of power they wield. But I don't know if that really, so I'm very sympathetic to that. I don't know whether that really does what I take it you would want, or that I would want in terms of specifically motivating philosophy. I mean, maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it motivates teaching, a bit of humanities more generally to people, which I'd also perhaps think is a good idea. But I don't know whether there's anything specifically philosophical there.
Well, to give you an example, so I once met a physician, and he was saying, no, you can't take this drug, it's not appropriate, it could kill you, right? And I was like, what? But this is not the scientific literature, like, how do you know that? And he told me, I know that because, I have 30 years of experience. And I'm thinking, well, in this case, I would want my physician to be a little bit better at thinking what evidence is. And this is like a philosophical issue. So when you said, I don't care as a patient, but my physician is a good philosopher, I'm like, well, sometimes I feel I would care. Like, they don't know what consent is. They don't know what autonomy is. I'm like, I would want them to know. I would want them to have a little bit idea of what evidence is, or maybe the limits of evidence. So I don't know. That's my idea. And that's my last question. Sorry.
Maybe what I said is too strong. But I still wonder whether you can't you know, you can't. I mean, I still think I still have a lot of time for the idea that there's tacit expertise that people can have as practicing physicians or anything, which is totally at odds with their explicit knowledge. And it may be that people say things that are ridiculous, but they don't actually do things. When it actually comes to what they actually do, it works out very, very well. And that's what I'm trying to be sensitive to. I mean, and that's an interesting case, because I do know, there are many philosophers of medicine who have, there are actually some philosophers of medicine who make rather, in my view, rather strong claims about the scientific evidence for or against this or that particular kind of treatment or drug or whatever. And I would trust a doctor who was, who was in, not any doctor, but a doctor who knew, who had various other indicators of being a good doctor, even if that doctor were not able to beat them in a philosophical debate about the evidential status of this treatment. So that's the counsel. I mean, I agree. I understand what you're saying. I agree. You do want some sensitivity to basic evidential reasoning. On the other hand, I don't think that I don't think that old doctors need to be able to win those debates in order to yeah.
It's not about winning a debate. It's about him advising me on a completely wrong decision as a patient.
No, I know. What I mean is, when I say about winning the debate, is that what he said was obviously stupid, but it could be that he's right. I don't know. The example, and maybe he's not right. But you could imagine a situation where some doctor says something like that. And I agree that it's almost always a very bad sign when someone says, "Trust me from years of experience," because so and I think it's pretty much universal that that's because your experience, how do you know? I mean, you didn't test your experience against the things you didn't do because you didn't do them. So I agree that's a particularly suspect thing to say. But what the reason I say lose the debate is that you can imagine a situation where somebody hasn't had a philosophical training, or they're not particularly articulate, but as it happens, they are rather good at prescribing the right treatment. And you could have another person who's rather good at explaining why, basically got a pretty good command of methodological principles and is able to explain that first guy is wrong. In fact, the first guy is right, or woman, whatever, and the second is wrong. But and what my worry is that what we teach people when we teach them to philosophize, and so I got the questions about the interaction between those abilities to that explicit reasoning ability and then what you actually do, and I think that anyway is the kind of case that I have in mind, the reason, what drives me to say that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, we've got a couple of more questions I'd like to try to get through. So Ryan wanted to ask a question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Alex, for your talk. There's a lot to think about there. I'm a little bit, my worry is a little bit related to the last question, I suppose. And I might be misunderstanding the role that the first part of your talk plays in what follows. But I sort of had the impression that the kind of the way you characterize philosophers or the way you more or less caricature philosophers and ethics, for example, in rejecting the curative model, for one, doesn't do justice to the way philosophy, for instance, shows up in hospitals and in medical pedagogy. But it might also not do favors for your upshot in the end about having sort of epistemic a role for philosophers in teaching epistemic humility, for example. I mean, I just think of, for example, like, of course, we might not have any interest in. There's lots of good reasons why we shouldn't teach medical students AIR, or teach them sort of a primitive picture of ethics as having a list of rules to give them or something like that. They won't find much use for that in the clinic. But more and more in the parts of the world I'm familiar with, namely the States and Europe, they each have committees of ethicists who at least have some kind of philosophical training, and they're there because they do a lot of work in making life and death decisions on a very much daily basis that saves the hospital loads of money, if we're worried about what medical deans think, on a sort of the most on that level, but it makes the jobs of physicians and clinicians much easier insofar as they have some good training in that respect. Certainly there's lots of bad examples we can give of ethicists or versions of ethics we might give to medical students, but that doesn't exclude that there are many good examples that are put to use on a daily basis in the hospital. And it seems to me that the role, say, that ethics plays in clinical day-to-day practice, or in just that, for instance, you make the good point that philosophy is good for teaching epistemic humility, and you mentioned in passing that might give be a place where the worries or interest in empathy and that kind of thing have some grip. But it seems to me that once you have that grip, there's a whole other world of philosophy, of things philosophers can do, and that philosophy actually does in a hospital on a daily basis. That might suggest that the case is being put too strongly in certain parts. I'll stop there. I'm kind of rambling.
Sure. Yeah, no, look, I mean, I was deliberately putting the case a little too strongly, as I said. I mean, I think there are contributions that philosophy can make. But there's two restrictions. I mean, the first, I'm looking for, so I think that what I'm saying in the first part of the talk is, if one is very hard-nosed about whether it actually helps doctors make good decisions if you train them in philosophy, then I think it's, which is, I think, you've got all these doctors coming through, medical students coming through, they're all going to be doctors, you give them all a philosophy course. What for? I think it's very hard to justify, to fully justify that on the basis of the effect it's going to have on their ability to heal people, the success rates in any measurable sense. I'm then going on to reject that way of thinking about what being a doctor is and what medicine is for. So I think I'm in tune with your instinct, but I'm being, and I agree, there's lots of things that philosophy can do with medicine, in hospitals and so forth. But I'm specifically talking about teaching every single medical student about, some philosophy. And I think, and I'm trying to adopt the position of the curmudgeonly medical dean, the person who doesn't think that it has any place in the medical syllabus, because it doesn't make a difference to whether doctors are better or worse at curing people. And I'm saying, well, and my stance is, I think that probably that person actually has quite a strong leg to stand on. So I think that, again, there's a kind of a burden of proof thing going on as well here. the case would need to be quite, I think that I'm not saying categorically that it makes no difference to your effectiveness as a doctor whether you've had a philosophical component in your education. I'm saying that I'm not seeing an obvious, clear argument that it does, obvious and clear enough that would merit something as substantial as the place I think philosophy actually probably does have in medical education. So that's why I'm saying something that might seem unpalatably strong. Yeah. I think that, you know, I think that, yeah, and I think, you know, this is the thing. I mean, I think that perhaps the task, you know, there's a task that hasn't been attempted, which is for somebody to come along and say, look, here exactly is why studying the following helps you to be a better doctor in the sense of curing people better. What I'm doing is saying, here is why studying the following helps you to be a better doctor in the sense of helping you to inquire. But I don't think that you can, I think there are some suggestive things, and I think that in the discussion, there have been some good suggestions about those sorts of things, but I'm not seeing a clear case that would really, you know, that's jumping out at me. I don't know how I would make the case really solidly to say, look, this is why being a philosophically trained doctor gives me a better, you know, a better cure rate than an unphilosophically trained doctor. That's the kind of dialectic.
I will have to email you because I don't want to hog my time.
Okay.
All right, I think we're going to have to end it